in 2009, we were fortunate to get a research grant to study roughly 150 villages across northern Karnataka. And what we found was very intriguing, actually. We focused on these mom and pop kiosks, mostly in the pharmacies. And we focused really on the last mile, like really remote villages, roughly 17 to 20 kilometers from district towns. And what we found out is that they had this habit of intentionally stocking out of essential medicines because they wanted to avoid the 220 rupee pickup cost of going to the district town to the wholesaler to pick up those drugs and to spend 5 to 8 hours on that journey. So it turned out that they had this really bad management behavior. And so what we ended up doing is starting to understand what, to do a 360-degree understanding of their problems and to build a technology around it. We figured out that there was a strong correlation between the poor management skills and also their poor inventory stocking and their poor management skills. So we tried to fill the gap. Next slide, please. So in general, what we learned is that at the periphery of the network, really in really remote villages, that there's not a lot of options. You have to rely on just a handful of middlemen if you're producing stuff, or if you're distributing things, then you only have perhaps 1 or 2 wholesalers in that taluk or district towns. So there's an over-reliance there. And all the logistics practices are very uncertain. You can make an appointment in a remote village and people may not show up. You're stuck for 2 hours waiting for that person. And I think those of you who've worked in remote areas understand this. So in the end, you have just a really high cost of performing commerce and a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of uncertainty. So that's the problem. In general, that's the problem. That's a generalized problem. Next slide. So the way we wanted to approach the solution was to connect all the people in the supply chain. And the reality of village logistics is that there will be many, many handoffs. A manufacturer, like a pharmaceutical distributor, will hand it off to an agent and hand it off to someone else, and that person will hand it off to the retailer, and there may be a delivery agent, etc. So there's so many handoffs. In the West, people have information systems all along that chain. The reality here is maybe the manufacturer and the wholesaler might have those things. So we tried to create an appropriate technology to allow everybody to connect. And so this is sort of a representation of how we had envisioned the intervention. Next slide. So what we've ended up doing is to build a platform that's agnostic to the hardware. In other words, it should work on all devices. It works everything from the prolific low-end phones all the way up to smartphones, tablets, and PCs, because there's a very broad range of what people are using in the villages. Some people will have smartphones, others will not. And that what we ended up trying to do is making it 2 ways. Most of the time, for the last 5 years, people working in this ICT space, focusing on emerging markets, were very focused on data collection. But what we learned is that data collection, the quality of data collection went much higher if you're giving back some useful information to that user. So there's this resonance where you give something and you get something. And so we tried to focus what kind of information can those users use in the villages to help them with their lives and make their lives easier. And then we produce that information, we deliver it to them, and then they feed us better quality data. You can click next. So it's not just data collection, and it's not really like an ERP, not just for accounting. What we really wanted to do is focus on how can we change the way people are doing things. If you focus just on accounting, you're saying that the way you do things is fine, we're just going to account for it. What we wanted to drive was some kind of transformation in their operations. Given the new paradigms, there were many more things they could try, and so we wanted to focus on those things. So next slide. So what did we actually do? We focused on data collection, of course, which is a necessity, but the technology is really apt to tracking inventory, tracking movements and locations, managing the commercial agreements, like placing orders and changing prices and changing those orders, giving delivery terms, etc. And then what we realized along the journey is that the reality of commercial encounters in the villages rely a lot on credit. So we began to manage credit on the same platform so people could keep track of those things. Next slide. So most people think of supply chains and the supply channel as a very hierarchical thing, but what we realized is people are doing business in every direction. One day you're a retailer, but suddenly these people are very entrepreneurial. There could be population growth or a new road could be built, and suddenly I will want to be a distributor. And they do that, and they do it at the drop of a hat. So we had to do this in a very abstracted way so that you could just flip on features rather than go in and do another intervention because they're doing something different. Next. And those nodes in the network were very abstracted to be anything, not just a stock room or a shop, but also a refugee camp or a bullock cart or a truck. So we tried to make it relevant to all many spheres. Next slide. So now I've been speaking very abstractly, so that's not fair to those of you unfamiliar with this. So let me try to drill down to some specifics. We work across a lot of sectors, but I'll talk about 4 examples of what we're working on. In Karnataka, we're working with Tata Steel, and they provide agricultural inputs for farmers. So imagine you're a marigold farmer in Davangere district, and you have an acre of land. They're very sensitive to timing. If you prepare the irrigation system even 1 week too late, the yield could go down 40%. So when Tata's supply chain was very fragmented, the Tata wires or tubes were not always on the shelves when they needed it. So if a farmer goes to that shop and the Tata wire is not there, even though it's a higher quality, they would very easily switch over to the Jindal or the other branded wires or tubes. So their aim was to keep things stocked and to always have that stock available. So stockouts were what was killing their market share. So with them, what we ended up doing is we changed the way they were doing business. In Karnataka, across 600 shops, rather than selling to the retailers, see, the status quo previously was the manufacturer would sell to a distributor who covered the entire state, and that the retailers would buy those things ad hoc and then on credit, and then pay back the distributor when they made their profit. But that was a very unreliable thing. It was very unpredictable, and they weren't able to take advantage of things like transportation consolidation and such things. So we ended up changing the business model such that the wholesaler would actually just rent shelf space for the retailer. And that's a model where it took the risk out of the system. The wholesaler was responsible for keeping available inventory across the network, rather than the retailer making those decisions in a disjointed fashion. And that helped change their market share, and it's slowly building up. Also in Karnataka, we're helping with the PHCs, the public health centers, for immunization. As you can imagine, having vaccines at the right place at the right time is very important for immunization programs. And they're also cold chain relevant and very expensive. So there's been a value add there. Yes, even higher. Okay, sorry. And in another example is in Bangalore. We're doing collection systems. So this is not just for distribution, but for collection, and where people are able to place an order for a pickup of recycling goods. So you have trash, you have plastics, papers, metals, etc. You can place an order online, and we farm out that tender to a number of what we call kabadiwalas. And this is in conjunction with a program called Recycle Guru in Bangalore that's run by Daily Dump, which is a pretty famous NGO. And then finally, we're working in UP and Bihar with pharmaceuticals. And so these are just similar examples of how we're trying to change the way people are doing things. And it's still an experience. We haven't hit that tipping point per se. Next slide, please. So obviously, when you have an IT intervention, you get certain types of impacts that you can talk about. Again, I'm mentioning these impacts because we were told to talk about the challenges, the approach, which I've covered now, and what are the impacts. So the trivial impacts are these things. You have a degree of automation, but that's not always welcome. Sometimes automation threatens people's livelihoods. People may not want things to be completely automated. I'm a sales guy. I don't want this. This needs to go through me. So you kind of have to work around the system in such a way that you don't threaten people's livelihoods, and you're able to still make an impact. So next slide. But what we really are, those are trivial impacts, the IT aspects. But what we really think are more important is the ability to transform the way you're managing your supply chain. So I gave the example up here of vendor managed inventory. That was the example I gave with steel. But we're also trying different things like, hey, why don't you work as a team? You can do revenue sharing, and we optimize those things and the prices, and we deliver it to them in a real-time basis, so that they can understand, hey, we can share the inventory, share the profits, and therefore encourage more throughput of certain social goods. And so we're trying that, and we're trying a number of different strategies, I think, that not all proven yet, but we're on the way. Next slide. Okay, so the real impacts are the social impacts. That's why we're in this game. The only reason we're doing all this stuff is to actually make a social impact. So all those things are very technical. But in the end, I think that what you really want to do is make sure that available inventory of essential medicines, vaccines, and essential drugs. And you want to empower people. So the same tools can help people cover more area, if they're a sales agent or a transporter, they can do more business. They can scale their business with these platforms. And to create employment. A lot of times what we've seen is, with the Kabaddiwala example, that these folks they had a job and they go pick up trash and they pick up recyclables. But now this is allowing them to behave more entrepreneurially. And so we think that it creates employment. And we think that when you have more reliance at the periphery of the network, that it becomes a more stable environment, more predictable environment. And I think that everyone can appreciate why that is important. So we really hope that we can raise the bar for excellence here. Thank you.